welcome everybody. My name is David Wylie. I'm essentially Commercial Director at Thames Water, and before I get going, I don't know if any of you read the history of this site here, which was really interesting. So, founded in 1812, this used to be, one of the major import hubs in the UK. So, tobacco, obviously given it its name, but also lots of other goods and wares from around the world came here. And if we'd have been here in 1812 when this site was set up, it would have been a hubbub of activity. Stuff coming in, stuff coming out, and lots of conversations going on. Lots and lots of deals being struck, lots and lots of relationships being struck, and really that sort of ability to use the relationship to get the best deals, the best products to where you needed to get them to. Which I think is a real theme, because what's happened over time is a lot of those sort of things seem to have fallen away. And I think sort of 160 years later, as procurement started to come about, and I'm one of the biggest procurement fans out there. I've spent my whole time in procurement, but that process started to destroy some of those sort of relationship pieces. So that's a bit of what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. But firstly, Thames Water. If you're in the UK, you probably know Thames Water pretty well. If you've had a cup of tea or a cup of coffee here this morning, you're inadvertently one of our customers. But we are moving around 7 billion litres of water a day, with the world's ultimate kind of circular economy. So you consume water, you get rid of water, we clean it back up, and it comes back around the loop. So, every day, that's our sort of our job. And the organisation's on a big mission at the moment, because we're really trying to improve what we do every day in a number of ways. Part of that's about customer service. So our customer service isn't where it needs to be. There's a big push on that. There's a big push on our impact on the environment. So what do we do in that space, and how do we, have less of an impact on the environment around us? There's a big piece about stopping leakage. So leakage is a huge problem in the UK. So how do we do that? And there's a thing about sort of simplification in what we do. How do we simplify what we do and become easier to deal with for our customers? So that's led to an interesting conversation with the executive committee about, well, how do we do that? And, some of that's through how we execute our procurement, and some of that's through how we think about our supplier management and our supplier relationships. And, one of the levers we haven't pulled anywhere near as hard over the last few years is how we deal with suppliers and how we get better value and leverage out of them. So I'm going to start here, which is this cartoon that I found the other day, which is, if you've been at sort of some of the sessions this morning, you'll have got this real sense of, unfurling doom, I suppose. And it'd be really dangerous to kind of walk away from today just hearing sort of story after story about things going wrong in the supply chain, which is kind of where we've been for the last few years. And, I was on the other stage in September talking about procurement issues. And I was sort of relatively confident then that, we're kind of coming out of that and things were going to get better. And actually, things have actually got worse, which sort of tells you something about my sort of predictive ability. But this thing here is, supply chain issues have become mainstream. They've entered the sort of mainstream of popular culture. And, you can see it in the newspapers every day. People are experiencing it in their everyday lives. And, this is something that's, been running a long time now and is going to continue for reasons I'm going to talk about in a little while. But also things that, people are starting to see impact them in very, very real ways, whether that be through sort of some of the inflation rates that we see, whether it's access to products or services. So again, thinking about how we go after supply chain issues is really important, because one of the big changes that we're seeing, certainly from a procurement side of things, is that the days of the strength of the buyer are gone. It's a seller's market these days. And that's why I think supply management is going to be absolutely critical. So what are we seeing? So UK, we're seeing a huge amount of job vacancies, lots of reasons for that, but huge amount of job vacancies. We're seeing the increase of inflation. So I've always been super pessimistic about inflation. Running at sort of 7-8% at the moment, may hit 10%, we'll see. We're seeing huge changes in working patterns. Again, I'm a little bit of a skeptic that might last, a huge amount of times, but we're seeing that change. And the great resignation. I think there's sort of come out of COVID, and people are really thinking about what they want to do with their lives and, how they change. Second one, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about China and Shanghai and some of the issues we've seen about out there in a moment. But we're seeing this sort of piece around container cost escalation, like feeding through into price inflation. Seeing the shutdown in China, so if anyone's following the sort of COVID situation in China, really getting worse and worse, and their reaction to that is to continue to close down society out there, which has many, many knock-on impacts. And this sort of question of the splinter of the global economy, are we starting to see a world where we might end up with two very sort of distinct and unplugged economies, to be seen? Energy prices. So energy prices have a massive impact on our business. We've got high energy consumption, as you might imagine, on our operational sites. That feeds into chemical pricing, another big issue for us as an organisation. But the sort of energy security is now becoming much more of a priority. And, this last point here around the net zero agenda, I was listening to a very interesting conversation next door, and I wonder whether we might start to see politically that slowing of that agenda as people focus more on sort of consumer energy pricing versus, that sort of letting the net zero agenda take its course. And then, of course, Ukraine, and, we can't talk about Ukraine without sort of reflecting on the human tragedy, much more important than the supply chain issues. But, we're certainly starting to see that's starting to feed through from a sanctions and a security of supply perspective, and that's starting to impact pricing. So I said I was going to quickly talk about this. This is a map of every ship waiting to get into Shanghai at the moment. So Shanghai is one of the biggest container ports in the world, absolutely critical to world trade. Waiting ships increased by over 15% over the last month. They were up 7% the month before. So there's more and more of these ships starting to build up. And we saw what happened in the Suez when the Suez Canal was blocked up. This is a similar sort of issue, but on a much grander scale. So a fifth of global containers are currently stuck in ports, and a third of that fifth are stuck here in China. If you look at what's happening up the coast, you've seen traffic going up 33% as people are trying to find places to unload their wares. And if you look at sort of warehouses closed, trucker shortages in China, arguably China are already in recession, you're starting to see, one of the big inputs of the global economy starting to struggle. And then this one, this does go a bit more upbeat as we go on, don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom and misery, it gets better. Next one's around, globalization. And again, I'm a bit of a believer that the sort of history of globalization has been, one of sort of free trade around the world. And is it coming to an end? My sort of view is it's certainly going to stall. It will probably start up again relatively in the sort of late, short to mid-term. But we are starting to see big changes in how the market flows. So certainly more protectionist type political movements around the world. Starting to see maybe some historical markets breaking apart. And, we're thinking about national security more than free markets. So all of that sort of lends us to a world where it's much more difficult to drive value, much more difficult to get access to the goods and services that you need. And this whole principle of seller's market rather than a buyer's market. So how does that play into how we think about sort of collaborative relationships in the future? And I've got another cartoon here, which is, I think if anyone who's worked in procurement for a period of time will recognise this cartoon, which is sort of, you and your supplier basically hammering the hell out of each other, trying to get the best deal for either side. And, in the long term, it doesn't really quite work. So, short-term benefit, but maybe a significant long-term cost. And maybe those people that have been very unfair or very unjust with their suppliers over the last few years might be finding that now is a difficult time to get what they need. The second one here is it's a picture of North Korea. We can't really see North Korea. North Korea's here. So North Korea obviously has a very sort of isolationist strategy, doesn't really work very collaboratively with its neighbours, you might imagine, and as you can see at some cost. This is South Korea. And North Korea, very little industrialisation whatsoever, so not much going on in that space. So we've been thinking about what does that mean for how we deploy supply management? How do we get value in a world that's changing, that's becoming ever more difficult to get the sort of goods and the services that you need? How do we get to a point where we can be, a supplier of choice? And I should say that this is very much a work in progress. So, I think often we come to these events and we listen to everybody's Instagram filtered world of procurement and you think, wow, everyone's perfect and my bit seems to be really clunky. Well, our bit's really clunky. This is just part of the journey that we're on. It's not the finished product. There's tons we've got to get right and tons more we've still got to do. But it just to talk you a little bit about the things we're thinking about. So, we think about the sort of the commercial life cycle and where we lose massive value. And, I look at it as sort of a spectrum, which I'll talk through a little bit in the roles that we have in a moment, but a spectrum of things that we can do to drive value through the life cycle of procurement. So it's everything from this end is more about sort of lock-in value. How do I make sure I get the value that I'm committed to at the start of a deal? And then going along the spectrum to how do I drive more value when I'm in the lifetime of a deal? So there's sort of 6 kind of headers here. So the first one's about governance and all those good things that underpin good deals. Second one's about being customer of choice. And I had a really interesting conversation with one of our suppliers yesterday who said, if only you gave us a better pipeline of what you were doing, if only we knew what you were really trying to achieve in Thames. And he said, and these slides are already in, you could get our A team. You could get a totally different group of people who could help you out. Next one's around sort of collaboration. How do we drive faster decision making? How do we get more brains on the problems that we've got? Value delivery. So, where can our suppliers bring us sort of new market opportunities or can improve, these 3 things here, big things for Thames, improve speed, improve our quality and improve our efficiency. And then into some of these sort of broader pieces too. So innovation, how do we drive new products, new services, new ways of doing things? And that's going to be absolutely critical in the future world. And improved alignment. How do we build a relationship with our supply chain where, they win, we win, and we can help them maybe use some of our sites as test sites or those sorts of things. So a lot of you will probably have seen a graph like this or something similar to this in the past, which is about where you drive value out of a supply management program. And I start here at the sort of the procurement promise stage. And the procurement promise is, you run through your strategic sourcing strategy, you come out with an answer, you sign a deal, and everyone sort of pats themselves on the back and off you go and go and celebrate a bit of success. At that point in time, you're only promising to deliver some value. Nothing's been delivered. So the key is that after you've done that promise, how do you deliver the value ongoing? And there's a few things that can happen once that contract's signed. And I've been in plenty of deals where we've ended up in the red line. So you sign the deal, off you go, and you get the value lost over time. The deal erodes. The supplier, maybe sort of starts to chip away at the scope or whatever it is, but you start to lose value. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment because it's an interesting kind of twist on how procurement teams measure their success. The second one is about value managed. So how do I think about improving value within the deal I've got? So, we think about that and I'll talk about how we manage that in a moment, but I sign my deal, I get the procurement promise, and I do better than that promise because I'm doing things in that block that add more value. And then there's the sort of value created. So thinking outside of that deal, how do I work with that supplier to create new value, to create new opportunities or new ideas that can bring value to both organisations? So I worked for a CFO once, and I was talking to him about, we should bring in a supplier management scheme, and he said to me, well, what's it going to save me? He sort of said, well, look, surely if I implement a supplier management scheme, you can take 10% off supplier pricing, right? Because our suppliers will like us a bit more and they'll give us a better price because they're not doing that now. That was his sort of basic kind of argument. And I found it a little bit odd, to be honest. And I talked to him about, effectively the last slide, all of these things. These are the things that it's going to save you. What's it going to save you? It's going to save you, problems with not getting items when you need it. It's going to save you the cost of poor quality. But for him, it was basically a lever you could use against your suppliers to drive just a simple cost improvement. So it's a bit of education in there too. I think The business case for this has changed though. So roll back pre-COVID, and I think there was tons of CFOs that were talking about the what's it going to save me question. I think a lot of that shifted, and it shifted because through COVID and through some of the supply chain issues we've got now, not having the right suppliers aligned up on the right things means you don't get the goods when you need them. And I think a lot of organisations have struggled in the last couple of years to find the products they need at the time they need them. And these are the sort of things that are going to help you get there. Now, one of the things I would say here is I'm always slightly mystified by the way that procurement measures itself. And I'm a great sort of believer in savings really isn't the right metric. Because if you're in this space here, the sort of savings you're going to generate as a procurement team are going to be much better. Because you get to the end of the deal, you've done a terrible job of managing it, so then you take another, £10 million off or whatever it is, and everyone goes, wow, well, great job, rather than actually terrible job because you haven't managed it. And the worse you manage it, the better your savings look. So there's something not quite right in that dynamic that I think as an industry we need to get to the bottom of. So I'm going to share this with you. This is how we look at the layers of success that we pull into driving our approach for supply management at Thames Water. So the first piece is around frontline operational management. So our people on the front line who are working at our sites every day, that are dealing with customers on call centres, that are out digging up the roads, whether they be our suppliers or our own people. These are the people that are really driving what makes a difference within the organisation. And I'd sort of call them our sort of brand advocates. Because if their interactions with the public and with our suppliers are different from what I'm saying, it drives a huge inconsistency. So this advocacy is really, really important. And thinking about how we educate them about our corporate values, how to deal with suppliers is really, really important. And then we've got a few sort of lines of activity that we have. So contract management, crudely, we would say is we deliver what's been agreed in the contract. So you've got a role which is, the contract says this, we deliver this. Second one's performance management, which again crudely is we deliver more than has been agreed in the contract. So these are generally the same person, but if you get this right, you can start to move onto that. How do we deliver more value, more quality out of the contracts that we have? Relationship management I see as a slightly different role, slightly different skill set. It needs to be a bit more innovative, collaborative. But these are people that are looking at new value outside of the contract, new value that's coming around. Risk management, we have a risk management team like many others, and they're assessing across their portfolio supply chain risk. But the critical thing that I think sort of defines the success of these activities is about senior sponsorship and the voice from the executive committee. Because if that's not there, I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's pushing a big rock up a big hill to make this happen without sort of executive support. So if you're thinking about a supplier management scheme, that's what I would be thinking about. So how does ours look? So we've got tiers, we tier it out like everybody else. Tier 0, we've got sort of 20 suppliers, probably too many actually, probably should have around seven or 8, but we've kept it quite large. These are sort of intensive, really important to our organisation, important to our customers getting the service that they get every day. Tier 1s, so about 30 odd suppliers, which is about what we've got. And then there's kind of everybody else here, 2,500, which is the rest of our sort of supply base that we do some work with, but it's more light touch and it's more about driving consistency. And then we have this Tier 3, which we call the hothouse, which is about how do we get small, innovative suppliers, and how do we take away some of the barriers that we tend to put in their way as kind of big organisations. So I thought I'd put a picture of a cute, fluffy dog on. So the same CFO who said to me, "What's this going to save me, David?" I took him through this once, and he said to me, "Look, isn't this all just about, it's fluffy nonsense, basically, supply management is nonsense, absolute nonsense. What you really need is a big baseball bat with nails hammered into it, and you just need to bash suppliers over the head." And I said to him, absolutely don't agree with that. This isn't about necessarily cosy chats or nice dinners or lovely coffees or whatever. But it is around about having honest, open conversations with people. It is about trying to co-collaborate with them, and it is about trying to drive meaningful change and structural differences in the way that you actually go out and buy things in the future. So I'll leave you with this, which is another cartoon, and sort of I'll leave off where I started, which is to think about sort of collaboration. And you know, when we think about collaboration, it's one of the most overused words in commercial, and then partnership, another really overused term. And I think we've got to really think about what partnership means. And this is a great example of, you know, how some organisations think about partnership. Ultimately, you know, they sort of say they want it, but deep down they really don't. So for me, that's the journey we're on. There's still tons for us to do. If we get it right, we will be, you know, in a very strong position, I think, to deliver for our customers. But you know, that's our thoughts on where we're taking it. So I'll pause there and take any questions that people have.
Excellent. Well, we have a question right down the front. Emily, are you able to bring the mic up? Excellent. Please introduce yourself and where you're from.
Femi Ibrahim, based out of, is that working?
Yeah.
Based out of UK, Energen Solutions. Thank you for the presentation, but I think I'm going to bother you with some of the slides. Can you go to the graph slide where you had all the value add? Yeah.
That one, yeah.
So quite interesting, right? I guess it's not about the fluff, but I guess this is all about supply chain, which we have been talking on, I think, for years. Now, when you come about the bottom, which is the value creation or value created, is when you're bringing in an extra person or relationship management, which takes me to the next couple of slides, whereby you're talking about an additional person or a resource, which basically is going to look at what is beyond the scope, whereby you can bring in additional value. So I'm just curious, so who are these clients that you would be able to kind of look at their overall business and say that this is what you've given us as scope, this is what we cover, but where can we add extra value by looking beyond that scope? Just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, so if we take, so we're sort of looking in this bucket here, and if you take, for example, pump suppliers, so we use a lot of pumps to pump water and to pump sewage around our network. And, you know, the biggest cost of a pump to us is actually the energy consumption. So, you know, one of the things that we're talking to our pump suppliers about is actually not about how do we get a cheaper pump, how do we co-develop with them and how do we co-incentivize them to come up with a pump that actually consumes less energy? And do we think about, you know, a world where, well, look, for every pound of demonstrable energy reduction they can give us, they could earn a percentage of that as a so it's not within the terms of the existing agreement, but it is something else that we're trying to drive a different mentality and trying to think about how do they incentivize. Now, the added sort of upside for them is that they then get to test their product on a Thames site. You know, we're the largest water company in Europe, and that's, you know, saleable for them as a sort of a reference point as well.
Thank you. Just a quick one before you go off. So I think you also mentioned about, lost my question.
That's good. Just down there, the lady on the left.
Hi, Katerina Vasilenko from Trade Information Network. You've touched upon your conversation with the CFO and how his primary concern was actually the cost savings. But I'm curious to know, when it comes to the financial viability of your suppliers, whose concern is that and who is managing that risk? Is it procurement? Is it CFO, or do you share this risk? And also, how do you manage that?
Yeah, so first off, I should be totally clear, this isn't the CFO at Thames Water, in case in some way he tunes in later. It's a previous CFO I work with. But so whose concern is it? I think, you know, we have a category management structure like most people would have, and we have a contract management structure within the organisation. And I think it's both of their concerns because, you know, we do, like a lot of organisations, we do a whole bunch of sort of financial checks when we come in, but things change over time. And I think we try and look at the world of, look, we don't want or we don't need supplier failures. And, you know, we fundamentally believe that our suppliers should be making money on the back of our business. So, you know, we do try and work and understand where our suppliers' financial situation is. And through COVID, actually, we had a every 2 week check in with the suppliers, just see how they were doing, whether they saw any threats on the horizon, and if there was anything we could do to help manage them through that from a cash flow perspective or a sort of forward ordering perspective or a commitment perspective. So I see it very much as our responsibility. Now, equally, we can't manage every risk that every single supplier has, but I think we do need to stay interested in making sure, A, we're good corporate citizens, but also making sure that for the suppliers that provide the goods and services that we need, that they're, robust enough to do that.
Thank you.
Any more from the floor? We have some coming in online. Why do you think it's taken so long for organizations to embrace supplier management when it seems like a no-brainer?
Yeah, great question. Absolute no-brainer. I think part of the problem is that the payback is slightly longer, and I think most organizations tend to think about, the window of a year, very short-term thinking. I remember I worked for a previous organization where, they almost ran their business as if the world was going to end on the 31st of December, and then were surprised when it didn't and started again. And I think if you think about supplier management, it takes a bit of time to lay the groundwork, to build the skills. To a certain extent, it's a cultural shift in the organisation because, if you spoke to my suppliers now about, does Thames do all the things that you've spoken about? Well, it'd be a bit patchy actually, because some of their experience on the ground isn't the same as what they're hearing from the leadership, and that takes time to shift. And I think that's why, really. I think people have struggled with the business case around, what's it going to equate to from a numbers perspective? Now it's, what's it going to equate to from a resilience perspective and a security of supply and a continuity of supply perspective?
And just one more from me. What did you mean by further indirect supply chain impacts? Can you give me some examples?
In terms of the issues that we're seeing? Yeah, I think for us, we live in a world where, we don't have great granular understanding of, tiers down our supply chain, what that impact might be. And one of the risks I always call out to my organisation is, without that, you're at risk of, a supply failure happening somewhere in the world that you really don't have a good enough grasp on. And semiconductors is an interesting one for us. A bit more sort of mainstream and a bit more obvious to people, but they go into our water meters, into our smart meters. So the sort of issues in the semiconductor market has impacted our smart meter rollout, pretty significantly. So, it's those things I think that you don't necessarily see every day.
Excellent. David, Wylie, thank you very much. We have to go because we have to set the stage up for the next panel discussion after lunch, but please continue the discussion. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Cheers.